St. Elwick's, nestled quietly between the rolling Dorset hills and the slow-ticking march of time, was the sort of village where nothing ever happened until, of course, something did. Ivy trailed lazily over honeystone walls, and bees hovered like gossip in the gardens. The world moves slowly in St. Elwick's, and that's precisely how its residents liked it. It was a Tuesday in late June, the sort of day where the breeze smelled faintly of lavender and sun-warmed bricks. In the vicarage garden, hedges had been clipped into obedient shapes, and folding chairs stood obediently around the perimeter of a white canvas tent. Beneath its shade, the Women's Gardening Circle was hosting its annual rose tea, an occasion for lemon drizzle cake, measured compliments, and veiled critiques about one's climbing clematis. Miss Jane Marple sat near the trellis, her knitting, needles moving like clock hands, steady, unhurried, yet marking something inevitable. She had been invited, of course. It would have been scandalous not to, but she knew her role. The widow with the silver bun and shrewd blue eyes was always welcome, so long as she didn't speak too much. People tended to forget she was even there until it was too late. Delightful. Weather, said Mrs. Weatherby, the new rival from Tunbridge Wells. Her pale blue blouse matched the forget-me-nots dotting the tablecloth. I was afraid it might rain, but it seems St. Elwick's knows how to behave, doesn't it? Yes, Miss Marple murmured with a soft smile. Though weather is often the least predictable of village affairs. A murmur of polite laughter moved through the women seated nearby. Not so much at the remark, but at the fact that Miss Marple had spoken at all near the refreshment table. Colonel Godfrey Pritchard was helping himself to a fourth slice of walnut cake. Retired from the army for nearly 2 decades, he still marched his way through village life as if directing troops. Next to him, the doctor's wife, Mrs. Fenella Crowthorne, fluttered her fan as she whispered something about a recent rash of lost heirlooms, a silver locket gone from the Hartley house, a pair of cufflinks from the inn. But most of the attention was centered around the hostess, Vivian Blake, impeccably dressed in cream silk, smiling too widely as she poured tea from a porcelain pot. A cascade of ivy framed the wooden trellis behind her, forming a picturesque backdrop for a woman who had worked very hard to become part of the village's set. Her husband, Cyril Blake, was a solicitor of some repute, known for his punctuality and for speaking in clipped syllables. That made his thoughts seem more important than they were. Miss Marple observed all this with the same attentiveness she gave to her rose pruners. She noticed that Vivian's smile stiffened every time Mrs. Weatherby praised her garden. She saw the way the ivy trembled slightly behind the trellis, though there was no wind. She noted, too, that Cyril Blake had not yet arrived, though he always made a point of appearing precisely 35 minutes into any gathering. He liked to be noticed for his restraint, and still, the cakes were eaten. The compliments were traded, and the village basked in its illusion of harmony. "Would you like more tea, Miss Marple?" asked a quiet voice. It was Clara Linton, the vicar's daughter, holding a delicate china pot in hands that trembled just enough to be noticed. She was a mouse of a girl, brown hair pinned back, eyes downcast, always useful. never present. Miss Marple looked up and smiled. "Thank you, my dear. You've done a lovely job arranging the garden. The delphiniums are quite bold this year." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes darting sideways. That was mostly Mrs. Blake's doing. She prefers strong colors. Miss Marple said nothing more, but the comment lingered like the scent of cut grass. From across the lawn came a loud burst of laughter. It was Mr. Jennings, the retired bank manager, telling another story about a scandal that had happened in Kent. Or perhaps it was Devon. His stories traveled more than he ever did. And then, just as the second round of tea had begun, and the conversation shifted from gardens to the proper etiquette for trimming roses, a strange thing happened. Vivian Blake dropped her teacup. It shattered like a scream. Several women gasped. Clara Linton rushed forward with a cloth, but Vivian wasn't looking at the porcelain. She was staring toward the trellis, her face ashen, her mouth slightly open. I need a moment," she said quietly, and left the tent with surprising speed, her heels crunching across the gravel path. Behind the trellis, a single ivy vine trembled again. Miss Marple's eyes lingered there for a beat too long. No one saw what she saw. Not then, not yet. Just a flicker of something unnatural. A shadow where none should be. A silence that felt. Deliberate. The tea resumed. The village exhaled. And Miss Marple, quietly knitting near the edge of the scene, didn't say a word. But she was already counting threads. It was not until the following morning that the village truly learned what had happened. The rose tea concluded as it always did, with scones. A few polite arguments about which marmalade was superior, and a mild sense of collective drowsiness. The women packed up their folding chairs. The vicar blessed the weather again, and Vivian Blake did not return. No one questioned it. After all, some women are prone to faintness. But by the next dawn, word had already crept along the hedgerows. Like dew, Cyril Blake had been found dead. It was Mr. Carter, the gardener, who made the discovery. Arriving early to tend to the wisteria along the Blake property's rear wall, he noticed the library doors were ajar. Cyril had always been pedantic about locks, a man who believed that bolts and brass held society together. Inside, Carter found the body slumped in the leather armchair near the fireplace, legs neatly crossed, as if asleep, except for the small, dry stain of blood just above the ear, and the poker missing from the hearth, lying 2 feet away, streaked dark. The official story spread before breakfast was over. "Murder. Can you believe it?" gasped Mrs. Longhurst in the post office, scattering stamps across the floor. In his own library, with the door open, added the butcher's wife, scandalized and delighted in equal measure. "I always thought there was something cold in that man," muttered Mr. Winchell, the milkman, who had never been acknowledged by Cyril in 10 years of deliveries. By 10 o'clock, half the village had already walked past the Blake residence. In solemn procession, curtains twitched, eyes peered. No one admitted they'd gone to look, but nearly everyone had at the edge of it all. Seated on her garden bench with a view of the trellis next door, Miss Marple folded her newspaper. It had arrived late, which she took as another sign. Clara Linton came to her gate. white-faced. "You've heard, Miss Marple?" "Yes, my dear. Poor Mr. Blake. A dreadful business." Clara hesitated. Do you think, Mrs. Blake?" "We'll be all right." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the ivy-covered fence. "She is adaptable." Before Clara could ask what that meant, a motor car arrived in the village, kicking up dust and turning heads. Not many outsiders visited St. Elwick's, and certainly not those in dark coats with serious eyes. Detective Inspector Graves emerged from the vehicle with the weary posture of a man. Accustomed to evil hiding in polite company, he was broad-shouldered, crisply dressed, and unimpressed by country manners. He knocked twice on Miss Marple's door, not for information, but out of obligation. The villagers always spoke of her, and it was best to keep her on one's good side. "Miss Marple." He nodded. "Graves, Scotland Yard. I'm sure you're quite busy," she said, her eyes kind and far too knowing. "I've just come from the Blakes' residence. Your gardener was the one who discovered the scene. Mr. Carter." "Yes, a good man. Very punctual. He arrives every Thursday at precisely 6:15. Graves made a note, then looked up. "Did you notice anything strange yesterday at the garden gathering?" "Oh, many things," she said, setting aside her knitting. "Strangeness is the most consistent part of human nature, I find." He gave a tight smile. "Any of them worth reporting? I believe you'll find more truth in teacups and cake crumbs than in any locked drawer," she said gently. "But yes, one thing struck me, a vine that moved without wind, and a woman who saw something behind it." Graves blinked. "A vine? An ivy vine, Inspector. That's where this began, and perhaps where it will end." He closed his notebook, unsure whether he had just received a clue or a poem. Back at the Blake residence, the official investigation began with all the standard procedures: photographs, sketches, the cataloguing of items on Cyril's desk, 2 letters unopened, 1 small ledger, and a half-written note that read, rather ominously, "She knows everything." Vivian Blake was found upstairs, sedated and weeping quietly into a silk handkerchief. She had no clear memory of the night before, or so she claimed. "I had a headache," she told Graves between tremors. "I left the tea early. Cyril wasn't home yet. I took a tablet and went to bed." "What time did you last see your husband?" he asked. "Yesterday morning," she said faintly. "He said he had business in Dorchester." "No argument between you?" She looked surprised. "We rarely argued, Inspector. Cyril didn't allow it." Graves made a note. Downstairs, a team dusted the room for prints. The poker bore only Cyril's. The library window was latched from the inside. No sign of forced entry. No footsteps in the garden path. The scene, it seemed, had been staged for silence, and yet the village had already decided on its culprit. Mrs. Weatherby was heard declaring over breakfast, "It's always the wife, you know, especially the beautiful ones." Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood once more near the trellis. She traced the edge of a bent vine with her finger. Ivy did not bruise unless something moved it, and ivy rarely moved on its own. Inside the library, the armchair stood empty now, cordoned with police tape. But in Miss Marple's mind, it was still full. A man who crossed his legs in death. A man who wrote half a message. A man whose library had been left unlocked by someone who wanted the village to find him. Murder, yes, but not of the violent sort. No rage, no mess, just something surgical, personal. Behind her, a bird called sharply in the elm, a sound to sudden, a warning. Miss Marple looked up, and for the first time in months, frowned. The pattern was wrong. The silence had been arranged too neatly. Title: Murdered beneath the ivy trellis section 4. Arrival of the police word count: approximately 1,430. Detective Inspector Graves didn't care for villages. There were too many teacups and too few straight answers. He arrived in St. Elwick's on Thursday morning, and by Friday, the charm had begun to curdle. The place reeked of fresh soil and older secrets. Everyone smiled politely. Everyone had something to say and something else to hide. The Blake residence had become a scene of careful procedure. Yellow cordon tape stretched across the garden gate. A green ribbon tied around the heart of domestic English civility. Officers moved between the house and the garden, notebooks in hand. Camera flashes bouncing off polished furniture. But for all the activity, Graves felt something was off. To staged, to still. He walked through the Blake home slowly. Again, a notepad folded behind his back. The library was too tidy, the blood discreet. The poker had been wiped, half-heartedly, as though someone wanted it almost clean. Cyril Blake had been bludgeoned, the coroner said, but only once. No signs of struggle. No defensive wounds. Either he trusted his killer, Graves muttered to himself, or he never saw them coming. He turned to Sergeant Hensley. Any updates from the housekeeper? She says Mrs. Blake was upstairs all evening, took a sleeping draught, claims she remembers nothing after retiring. Too convenient, Graves said, and rubbed his jaw. And the window, locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. Doors locked too, except the one Mr. Carter found open in the morning. Graves looked around the room again. The chair had been turned toward the fireplace when the body was found, but a neighbor swore it had originally faced the window. He didn't like that. Murderers were messy, but this had choreography. He left the library and found Vivian. Blake in the sunroom, sitting in a pale green chair, looking impossibly fragile. Her eyes were dry now, but her voice had that silken tremor only certain women could maintain for days. "I'm told you've already given a statement," Graves said. Gently, she nodded. "I told Sergeant Hensley everything. Would you mind telling me as well?" Vivian smoothed a wrinkle from her skirt. "There's very little to tell. I had a headache. I left the tea early. Cyril wasn't home yet. I took one of my pills and lay down. Did he often stay out late?" "Lately? Yes, he said he was meeting clients in Dorchester. But," her voice faltered, "lately he'd seemed anxious, secretive. He never said why." "Did he have enemies?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Cyril had a gift for making people feel small. I suspect that leaves a long list." Graves leaned forward. "Were you afraid of your husband?" Mrs. Blake. She paused. I wouldn't say afraid, but there are bruises that don't show, Inspector. He scribbled something in his notebook, then looked up. Do you know a woman, perhaps local, who wore pale green gloves and met your husband at the Green Hart Inn? Vivian blinked, then stared at him as if he'd slapped her. No, but you're sure she was local? No, that's what I'm trying to find out. Vivian looked away. He had affairs. I won't pretend otherwise, but I never thought they'd lead to this. Graves stood. Thank you, Mrs. Blake. We'll speak again. Outside, a constable was speaking to Clara Linton by the Trellis. She looked like a girl in a windstorm, quiet, rattled, ready to fall. Graves approached. Miss Linton, I'm told you may have seen something unusual the day before the murder. Clara looked at him, then at the ivy. I was serving tea, she said softly. Mrs. Blake dropped her cup. It was so sudden, but just before, I saw a movement behind the trellis. What kind of movement? She hesitated. Someone was there. I don't know who, just a flicker of a shadow. It could have been a bird, or someone watching. She nodded faintly. Yes, I think they wanted to be seen. Just for a second. Graves looked at the trellis. The ivy grew thick, coiled like suspicion. Could you identify them? No. I only saw a shape. I thought maybe it was Gregory Bell. He has that coat, with the high collar. But then, he said he was at the train station. Graves made another note. That evening, the police visited Gregory Bell's cottage. He was in his garden, pruning hedges like a man trying to trim away worry. I was in Dorchester. He told them flatly. My uncle, Harold, you can ask him, had a dispute I had to sort. Cyril Blake made trouble for him years ago. I wanted to make peace. Do you have a receipt? A train ticket? He pulled one from his wallet, stamped. Could you have returned early? Asked Graves. No. Why would I? Gregory's face flushed. Look, I hated Cyril. Everyone did. But I didn't kill him. Graves nodded. Did you see him recently? Not for weeks. He had nothing to say to me that wasn't a threat. As they left, Graves turned to Sergeant Hensley. We've got a widow with secrets, a gardener who saw too much, a village full of gossips, and a dead man with enemies. Where do we start, sir? Graves sighed. We start with Miss Marple. She's seen everything and said nothing, and that makes her dangerous. That night, a knock sounded at Miss Marple's door. She welcomed Graves in, offered tea, and listened with mild curiosity as he explained the state of the investigation. I thought you might have noticed something, he said at last. I've noticed many things, Miss Marple replied. Most of all, how eager people are to be helpful, in order to avoid being questioned themselves. Do you believe Mrs. Blake? Miss Marple folded her hands. I believe she is telling the truth about what she remembers, but perhaps not all she knows. Graves leaned forward. Do you have a theory? Oh no, Inspector. I have several. And in her eyes, quiet, gleaming, something far sharper than speculation was beginning to take shape. By Friday afternoon, St. Elwick's had shed its skin of tranquility, and replaced it with suspicion. It began, as such things often do, at Mrs. Penelope Drake's tea table. "Well," she said, eyes glittering with a sort of restrained glee, "I always said, Cyril, Blake was the sort to make enemies. That man had a stare like a carving knife." Her guests, Mrs. Godfrey, Miss Alcott, and the ever-punctual Reverend Timothy Finch, leaned forward like daffodils toward sunlight. The lace tablecloth bore evidence of scones and jam, but no one was paying attention to crumbs today. "I heard he threatened young Gregory Bell," whispered Miss Alcott, the retired schoolmistress, over a legal dispute with the boy's uncle. "Gregory took a swing at him outside the post office, witnessed, no less, by the vicar's wife. Hardly enough reason for murder," muttered Reverend Finch, though his tone suggested he was not ruling it out. Mrs. Godfrey leaned closer. "But what about Mrs. Blake? I mean, she did run off at the tea party, and no one saw her again that evening. Isn't that peculiar?" "She had a headache," said Miss Alcott, though not very convincingly. Mrs. Drake stirred her tea with exaggerated calm. "Vivian always did enjoy a dramatic moment, didn't she? There's something theatrical about her grief, don't you think?" Silence followed, not agreement, precisely, but the sort of pause that allowed rumor to thicken. Meanwhile, in the high street, at Bixby's grocery, more theories bloomed. "Reckon it was the solicitor's assistant," said Mr. Bixby, weighing carrots. "That lad with the limp. What's his name? Martin something. Always looked at Blake like he wanted him buried. He was dismissed last month. Offered Mrs. Langley from behind a shelf of plum preserves. Over something to do with numbers, embezzlement, they say. Quiet about it, of course. But nothing stays quiet long in this village. Could have been blackmail," muttered a man near the till. "Plenty of that going around these days." "Do we know it was murder?" piped up young Lucy Cartwright, clutching a bag of barley sugar. The shop fell still. "Murder," said Mr. Bixby solemnly, "leaves its own kind of echo. And yet, in the corner cottage by the green, Miss Marple was not echoing anyone. She sat in her sunlit sitting room, a steaming cup of Darjeeling beside her, eyes calmly scanning the pages of her gardening book. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over stories, half-spoken phrases, and the tight, tense movements of a community spinning in fear. She had seen it all before. People believed crimes began with violence. But no, they began with a quiet shift in the air, a hesitation in a voice, a glance that went unreturned. Cyril Blake had not been loved. He had been respected, perhaps, and feared. But love was another matter. That opened the field widely down at the Green Hart Inn. A different theory took root. He had a mistress, whispered Elsie. The barmaid, to her cousin from Bath, came in here more than once with a woman not his wife, sat in the booth near the fireplace, ordered a single brandy, always the same. She wore gloves even in May. Do you know who she was? Elsie shook her head. Never seen her in the village before, but she left something once, a scarf, pale green. I found it and gave it to him the next day. He said nothing, just took it and walked out. The cousin's eyes widened. Think she might have come back. Maybe she never left, said Elsie, glancing toward the upstairs windows outside the inn. Miss Marple walked slowly along the green, hands folded neatly. She passed the fountain and the church gate, nodding to the vicar, who was discussing the distress to the moral fabric with the baker. She stopped at the market stall and bought 2 apples. Granny Smith's, she remarked, a sharp flavor, cuts through sweetness. The stall holder blinked, uncertain whether she was talking about apples or murder. Behind her, 2 young women whispered in a hush that carried, "I heard the body was moved." Really? Yes. Clara Linton said the chair was turned facing the window, as if he were watching something when he died. But the report said it was by the fireplace. She swears she saw it herself. Before the police came, Miss Marple's fingers stilled for just a moment over her coin purse. Such details, she thought, were never trivial. Back at the vicarage, Clara Linton sat quietly, folding him books. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she said nothing. The Reverend offered her tea. She shook her head. "It's just, I keep thinking I saw someone behind the trellis just for a moment, before Mrs. Blake dropped her cup." "Did you recognize them?" She hesitated. "No, or maybe. I thought I saw Mr. Bell, but that can't be right. He said he was at the station. He even showed the ticket." The Reverend patted her shoulder gently. "Your mind's playing tricks, my dear." But Clara's hands trembled. That night, Miss Marple wrote in her little diary with a fountain pen. Her script was delicate but firm. People are already choosing suspects based on their own wounds and loyalties. None of them are asking why the murder happened in the library, or why the poker was used, or why the tea party was the stage. She paused, then added, "Someone wanted the body found quickly. That means they wanted a performance. But for whom? And why now?" The wind rattled the ivy outside her window, and somewhere not far from her cottage, someone else was awake, pacing, fuming, watching the shadows of the village crawl across the walls. The village was alive with secrets now. It had swallowed one man whole, and Miss Marple knew. It was only just beginning. It is a strange thing how quickly a man's life can be emptied out like a drawer. One day he is solid, authoritative, gliding through his home like a monarch of wood-paneled rooms. The next, he is a list of items, names, and debts, reduced to who disliked him most and who had the most to gain. By Saturday, Cyril Blake's memory had already begun to curdle. The villagers no longer said Mr. Blake. They said Cyril. They said it with a certain bitter relish, like the final twist of a knife in an old argument. Inspector Graves sat in the Blake library, surrounded by piles of Cyril's private life, unopened bank statements, love notes not from his wife, a receipt for a safe deposit box in Dorchester, and 2 typed letters marked confidential tucked inside a book on land law. The pages detailed a legal dispute between Cyril and his own cousin over property, of course. Always property. He was involved in more than one legal case, Sergeant Hensley reported. Scanning the files, several, actually, he represented. The Harcourts during that inheritance dispute got the elder brother disinherited, Any enemies made there? Plenty. The younger Harcourt left the country. The elder stayed and hasn't spoken to anyone since. Graves shook his head. So many grudges. It's like sorting through a hedgehog's nest. They already interviewed Martin Price, the former assistant at Cyril's law office. Dismissed quietly 3 weeks ago. The man had gone pale when confronted. He was cruel, Martin said, but clever to clever. He threatened to report me for negligence, but it was his error. I just typed what he dictated. Graves leaned forward. You didn't retaliate, only with words. Martin's jaw clenched. I'm not a murderer, and yet there was something dangerous about the desperation in his voice. At the Green Hart Inn, further rumors bloomed. The barmaid, Elsie, recalls seeing Cyril arguing with a tall man in a black coat a week before the murder. He was older, had a scar along his chin, the sort of face you don't forget. Graves circulated the description through the department, but got no immediate hits. At the Blake residence, Vivian remained in a silk dressing gown and rarely left her room. When asked if she knew anything about a man with a scar, she simply blinked and said, "My husband knew many people. I made a point not to know most of them." Miss Marple, however, had her own methods. She had quietly paid a visit to Mrs. Lillian Purdy, Cyril's former secretary, now retired and tending to her late husband's dahlias. He was a cold man, Lillian said, shaking her head as she served shortbread. Efficient, yes, brilliant, perhaps, but cold and deeply afraid of scandal. Scandal? Miss Marple asked, accepting her tea with a grateful smile. An affair, I think, or something worse. He had a way of locking things up. In safes, in ledgers, in hearts. He once asked me to destroy a letter. I didn't. May I ask, why? Not. Lillian gave a faint, sad smile. Because it wasn't addressed to him. It was from a young man. A plea, really, about being seen in a place he shouldn't have been. It wasn't my place to interfere. But I couldn't burn it either. Did Cyril respond? He told me never to mention it again. He was trembling. Miss Marple, shaking like a leaf. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple reread her notes. The man had been feared, yes, but something else lingered. Something beneath all that rigidity. Attention. It was not just that Cyril had enemies. It was that Cyril had secrets. Later that evening, Graves returned from the Dorchester Bank. The safe deposit box had been opened, its contents neatly catalogued. Among the documents were photographs, grainy, poorly lit, but unmistakably damaging. One showed a man, possibly Gregory Bell, at a poker table with an illegal betting ring. Another, more troubling, showed Vivian Blake standing beside a man not her husband, their faces close. Too close, Graves laid the photographs on the desk and stared. Why keep these? Blackmail, Hensley offered. Maybe, or maybe insurance. He liked leverage. On everyone. Yes, Graves muttered. And someone decided to cancel his policy. That same night, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. The air was soft, and the ivy on the trellis rustled faintly. In the breeze, she stopped outside the Blakes' back garden and stared through the gaps in the leaves. The shape of the garden was symmetrical, balanced, too much so. She remembered something Mrs. Weatherby had said at the tea party. Your garden is almost theatrical, Vivian, like a stage set, and now the whole village felt like that. A stage dot. She watched shadows fall across the grass, remembering how Vivian had dropped her cup. Not at a sound, at a sight. Vivian had seen something behind that trellis. Not a stranger. Someone she recognized. Someone she feared, or regretted, or perhaps loved. Miss Marple turned back toward her cottage, her knitting waiting patiently on the table dot in the firelight. She picked up her needles and whispered to herself. He was not killed for who he was. He was killed for what he knew. It was inevitable that the villagers would find a suspect. It's what villagers do when something terrible interrupts the rhythm of tea times, sermon schedules, and flower shows. They locate a thread that looks out of place and tug until it unravels. And Gregory Bell, poor creature, had enough loose ends to knit a whole scarf. It began at the greengrocer, when Mrs. Langley was overheard whispering to her daughter. It was Gregory, I'm sure of it. He hated Cyril, practically shouted it, on the village green, and he's always been volatile. I heard he was dismissed from the tennis club, added the butcher's son. Over temper, said another. Smashed a racket last summer. Called Cyril. Well, something unrepeatable. By the end of the day, the villagers had settled into a comfortable hypothesis. Gregory Bell was young, proud, emotionally unstable, and, crucially, unable to afford a solicitor. In a place like St. Elwick's, that was motive enough. The police weren't far behind. Inspector Graves had been quietly piecing together the fragments. Gregory's grudge over his uncle's property, loss, the public argument with Cyril, and now a mysterious withdrawal of £500 from Gregory's bank account the day after the murder. Cash, Graves said grimly. Always cash with these types. Sergeant Hensley gave a reluctant nod. Should we bring him in? We'll question him again. But not yet. I want to watch what he does when the village turns cold. And cold it had become. Gregory Bell stood on the edge of the cricket field that evening, staring toward the Blake house. His face was tight, fists clenched at his sides. Miss Marple passed him on her walk, nodded politely. They think I did it, he said suddenly. She paused. And did you? No. But it won't matter. I've seen how this village works. Once you're chosen, that's it. Miss Marple tilted her head. Then perhaps don't behave like someone with something to hide. He let out a breath. Do. You think I'm stupid enough to leave a body staged in a library if I'd done it? Cyril was a monster, but he was a clever one. You'd have to be twice as clever to kill him and not get caught. That's an interesting point. She said, do you know who might be that clever? He hesitated. I don't know, but I don't think he was killed because someone hated him. I think he was killed because he found out something. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So you believe he was silenced, wouldn't you? Later that evening, Inspector Graves arrived at the vicarage. I need to speak to Clara Linton, he said gently, alone. The Reverend frowned. She's had a difficult few days. I won't be long. In the drawing room, Clara sat on a floral settee, her hands folded like paper cranes. "Miss Linton," Graves began, "you said you saw someone behind the trellis. Do you still believe that?" Clara nodded faintly. "Yes, just a shape, a coat, a movement. Was it Gregory Bell?" "I don't know. You suggested it might have been him." I said it reminded me of him, but it was only for a second. Would you be willing to sign a statement saying you saw him?" Her face paled. "No, I can't be sure." "I won't lie." Graves watched her closely. "Did someone tell you not to say more?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "No one told me. But it's there. The way people look at me now. Like I'm made of thread, and I'll unravel if they pull too hard." Graves sighed and stood. "Thank you. If you remember anything more, come to me directly." Miss Marple, for her part, had no interest in Gregory as a suspect. He was too obvious, too dramatic, too loud. The guilty party in St. Elwick's would be someone softer, quieter, someone polite, who believed in appearances. That evening, she paid a visit to Vivian Blake. The house was dim, the curtains drawn. Vivian received her in a small side room, once a music room, now filled with silent furniture. "How kind of you to come," Vivian said, her voice soft. "I thought you might appreciate some company," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "Grief is isolating." Vivian nodded. "Yes, and the village is watching, as if waiting to see how I'll perform." "Is it a performance?" Vivian met her gaze. "Do you think I killed him? I think you had many reasons to hate him. But that's not the same thing." Vivian looked away. "He was cruel. In little ways, mostly. Never bruises. Just control. Silence. I didn't cry when they told me he was dead. Does that make me guilty?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "It makes you honest." A long pause. "Do you know what I regret most?" Vivian whispered. "That I didn't leave him when I had the chance. Years ago, I stayed out of fear, and vanity, and shame." "Did he know you were thinking of leaving?" "Yes, and he threatened me with ruin. Said he'd destroy my name. Said no one would believe me. And perhaps he was right." Miss Marple studied her. "Do you know who might have killed him?" Vivian hesitated. "I think he was going to expose someone. Someone important. He said to me, 'I'm holding a match near the thatch. Let's see who flinches.' And I think someone did." Outside, the village slept uneasily. Behind drawn curtains, families whispered. Behind hedgerows, secrets grew thick. Miss Marple walked home beneath a clear sky. Stars blinking like distant warnings. The pieces were moving, and soon someone would make a mistake. The first suspect had been chosen, but the real one was still in the wings. Sunday brought church bells and suspicion. The congregation at St. Elwick's gathered with their hymnals and their whispers. And as the reverend intoned the opening prayers, not a single villager failed to glance, subtly. Of course, at the pew where Vivian Blake now sat alone, her black veil drawn like a curtain between herself and judgment, Miss Marple sat, a few rows behind, her gloved hands folded neatly, eyes drifting not toward the altar, but toward the expressions of those around her. For Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that human behavior was a symphony, and that even the gentlest music contained a dissonant note if you listened long enough. After the service, the villagers spilled into the gravelled courtyard like spilled sugar. Tea was to be served in the church hall, a local custom more about comfort and gossip than devotion. "I'm surprised Vivian came," whispered Mrs. Penelope Drake to Miss Alcott, not bothering to lower her voice. She always did enjoy dramatic entrances, replied Miss Alcott, tutting beneath her bonnet. Miss Marple, meanwhile, chose her table carefully, not near the center, not near Vivian, but at the edge, beside a battered table where a plate of scones steamed under a gingham cloth, and where people tended to forget who was listening. Clara Linton passed by first, her eyes red-rimmed again. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. "You're very brave, my dear." Clara offered a wan smile. "Brave or foolish? I'm not sure which." A pause. "Do you remember exactly what you saw?" Miss Marple asked softly. Clara nodded. "Yes, a shadow. Movement." And then Mrs. Blake dropped her teacup. "I think she saw it too, but she hasn't said a word about it." Sometimes, Miss Marple said, people protect others by remaining silent. Clara looked startled. "You think she's protecting someone? I think she's hiding something. And that's not always the same thing as lying." Clara's lips parted as if to say more. But just then, Gregory Bell walked past. Heads turned. Conversations halted for just a moment too long. He looked haggard, unshaven, tense. He passed Vivian without a glance. She did not look up. But Miss Marple watched and saw the smallest flicker of recognition pass between them. A subtle tightening in Vivian's jaw, a near imperceptible dip of Gregory's head, as though nodding to a memory he no longer wished to carry. After the gathering, Miss Marple took the long way home, not to reach her cottage, but to stop by the vicarage garden, where the Reverend himself was pruning roses in the sunshine. "Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly. "You look thoughtful." "Always. I'm afraid," she smiled. "I find a walk after tea helps with digestion and reflection." "Quite so. It's a troubled flock this week." "Reverend, do you recall Cyril Blake attending church?" The Reverend paused, his shares still in the air. "Not often. Only on civic holidays, and always at the very front. He enjoyed being seen." "Did he speak to you privately?" Confession. "Perhaps no. Cyril wasn't a man for unburdening. Though he hesitated. He did once ask me for a recommendation, for a counselor. Said a delicate matter needed discretion. I gave him the name of a man in Dorchester. Recently, about 2 months ago. Did he ever follow up? I couldn't say, but I had the feeling he wasn't asking for himself." Miss Marple made a thoughtful noise. "Thank you, Reverend. And please, do be careful with that rose. The thorn near the base is rather wicked." Back in the village, the conversations continued. At the inn, Martin Price, the dismissed assistant, had returned, claiming to be collecting papers he'd forgotten. But Elsie, the barmaid, overheard him asking questions. Odd ones. Who else used the Blake solicitor account? Did Mr. Blake ever discuss his will in public? Was there talk of an heir? He had not ordered a drink. When Miss Marple passed the inn later that day, She paused long enough to spot Martin leaving through the side door, and not alone. With him was a woman, dark-haired, tall, wearing gloves despite the heat. Her gait was stiff, her face mostly obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Miss Marple frowned. She had seen those gloves before. Pale green. By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned home and pulled from her drawer a small stack of index cards. Each bore a name, a date, a place, her personal filing system. The quiet archive of patterns she'd observed across decades of village life. She added a new one now. Gloved woman unknown. Seen with Cyrilin. Now seen with Martin. Connection to both. Not local. She sat by the window, watching the trellis behind the Blake home sway gently in the wind. There were too many layers to this performance. A woman afraid, a man accused, a village whispering in unison, and behind it all, someone who remained quiet, someone who was not afraid, someone who had made the perfect move, and now waited, calmly, for the dust to settle. Miss Marple stared at the ivy. Something was behind it, not just during the tea party, but behind all of it. She waited. People always said she was patient. They didn't understand. She wasn't being patient. She was listening. The clue had been there all along. Small, quiet, entirely unremarkable, just like most truths in village life. It came to Miss Marple on Monday morning as she watered the potted hydrangeas on her back step. The ivy that separated her garden from the Blakes rustled with a breeze that was barely a whisper, and she paused to observe it, as she had every day since the tea party. The trellis, though charming, was of no great construction. Wooden lattice painted white, now chipped. Ivy climbed across it in graceful coils, but just above the central arch was something that had gone unnoticed. A snap. One of the lattice strips, only one, was cracked. Subtle, barely a bend in the pattern, but it had not been cracked. The week before. Miss Marple set down her watering can, approached, and ran a gentle fingertip across the fracture. It was fresh, a break, not a weathered warp. Something had pressed against it with force. A knee, a foot, a person. Not someone standing, someone crouching. She turned and looked back toward her own garden, then toward the Blake house. From that angle, only a crouched figure would have been able to observe the tea party unnoticed, or nearly unnoticed. From behind the ivy, just enough movement to draw a glance, just enough presence to terrify someone who knew them, someone like Vivian, inside her cottage. Miss Marple fetched a pair of opera glasses, a gift from a cousin in Bath who had long since stopped attending the theatre, and trained them. Through the trellis gap, the line of sight led directly to the white tent that had housed the rose tea, specifically to the head table where Vivian had sat pouring tea. She adjusted the lens slightly. A slip of reflection glinted from a nearby bush, something small. She took a few steps along her side of the fence and spotted it in the grass. A silver cufflink. Tiny. Square. The kind that was engraved on commission. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she fetched a handkerchief from her sleeve, delicately, wrapped the object, and placed it in her coat pocket. Later that day, She brought it to Inspector Graves. "I found this," she said calmly, placing the wrapped parcel on his desk. He unwrapped it and frowned. "A cufflink. Just one," she replied. "I believe its pair is missing, possibly somewhere near the Blake Library." "Where did you find it?" "In the grass beneath the ivy trellis," she said. "From the angle, I believe someone knelt behind the fence during the tea party, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting, perhaps afraid of being seen." Graves examined the engraving. C.J. Cyril Blake's middle name was John. He murmured. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "But I don't think this belonged to Cyril." Graves looked up. "I believe it belonged to someone close to him. Someone who used the same tailor, the same jeweler. Someone who admired Cyril, perhaps even mimicked him, until admiration turned to resentment." "Who are you thinking of?" She didn't answer. Not yet. That same afternoon, Martin Price was seen at the train station. He purchased a one-way ticket to London and wore gloves despite the heat. But he never boarded the train. Instead, he lingered on the platform, watching the village recede behind the hedgerows. Miss Marple heard about it from the station master, who always shared a biscuit with her when she passed on her way to the grocer. "He stood there for ages," the man said, like he was deciding something. "And did he? No. He tore up the ticket and walked back to the village." Meanwhile, Clara Linton came to visit Miss Marple, a rare move, as Clara was not known for initiating conversation. "I remembered something," she said, twisting the edge of her cardigan. "It may be nothing, but I keep seeing it in my head." "Go on," said Miss Marple gently. "When I brought Mrs. Blake her tea that day." Before she dropped the cup, she was looking at a small piece of paper, folded like a note. She crumpled it when she stood up. "I don't know what happened to it." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind leapt. A note. If someone had slipped Vivian a note during the tea party, a threat, a warning, even a message from Cyril, that would explain her panic. "Did you see where she placed it?" "No," Clara said. "But I did see someone pick up something from the ground just after she left." "Who?" Clara hesitated. "Gregory Bell." He bent down quickly, stuffed something in his jacket. "I didn't think about it at the time." "You've done well, my dear," Miss Marple said, placing a hand on Clara's arm. "You notice more than you think." That evening, the village square felt unusually silent, as though everyone was listening for something, or afraid that someone might say too much. Miss Marple returned home, unwrapped the cufflink, and placed it beside her teacup. The initials weren't a mistake. The break in the trellis wasn't. Random, the note, whatever it said, had changed the course of the afternoon. But what lingered most in her mind was the staging. Cyril Blake had been found seated, legs crossed, as though observing something with satisfaction. That pose wasn't one of surprise or struggle. It was final, intentional, like a man playing the last move in a game he had already won. Unless he hadn't won. Unless he had thought he'd won, and someone had taken the board away before he could finish. Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea and looked out the window, where the ivy swayed again. This time, It wasn't the wind, Dot, it was someone watching, still waiting, still believing they were unseen. But Miss Marple had seen, Dot. She always did, Dot, by Tuesday morning. St. Elwick's was no longer a village. It was a pressure cooker. The murder of Cyril Blake had loosened the hinges on everyone's privacy. Things said in confidence were repeated in confidence to someone else. Things buried were being exhumed, slowly, with whispered gasps and sidelong glances. The village wasn't solving the crime. It was spreading it, Dot, at the bakery. Miss Alcott revealed to no one in particular that Cyril Blake had once made a large anonymous donation to the church's roof fund, only to withdraw it weeks later after a sermon on humility offended him. At the tailor's, Mr. Groves confessed that Cyril had ordered a new set of cufflinks the month before he died, engraved not with his initials, but with another's. MP Martin Price? Muttered Sergeant Hensley when he heard. Martin, said Inspector Graves, is becoming a shadow that keeps appearing just outside the frame. Vivian Blake, meanwhile, had ceased her public appearances. The blinds in her home remained drawn. No shopping, no church, no walks, only visits from the doctor and, once, a delivery boy who claimed to have seen a man slip out the back gate just after sunset. When questioned, Vivian said she'd had no visitors. Her face was calm, to calm Dot at the inn. The staff reported that a certain room 4, had been paid for in advance by an unknown party and remained locked since the day after the murder. The key was missing. The room had not been entered. Miss Marple was not surprised. She walked the village that afternoon with a quiet purpose. Her eyes were not on people, but on the patterns of the village. A dog barking at a shuttered window. A young boy throwing stones toward a hedge that had recently been trimmed to neatly, and an envelope wedged in the postbox of the old butcher's shop, which had been closed for months. It was the kind of envelope used by solicitors. Back in her sitting room, she reassembled the threads. Cyril Blake had enemies. That was not in doubt. But more than enemies, he had information. He'd been preparing something. Notes, photographs, letters, possibly a statement, possibly blackmail, possibly revenge. But the most troubling thread was not the motive. It was how many people seemed to know about it. Cyril had threatened to reveal secrets. Yes, but it now appeared he had shared that intention with more than one person. Vivian, Gregory Bell, Martin Price, and, if her instincts were correct, Clara Linton had seen something far deeper than she understood. She was the thread in the center of the weave. That evening, Miss Marple paid her a visit. Clara opened the door, her face pale, hands tucked into the sleeves of a wool cardigan despite the summer warmth. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "Nonsense," Miss Marple replied gently. "You're worried, and worried people don't think clearly. I brought you honey cake." Inside, they sat on a faded sofa, tea steeping. Between them, "I'm scared," Clara whispered. "Not of the killer. Not exactly. I'm scared of what I might know." "Memory is a funny thing," said Miss Marple. "It stores everything, but only offers us fragments. I think I saw someone that day. Someone near the Trellis. I keep saying I didn't, but I did." "Who?" Clara hesitated. Martin Price Clara nodded. I saw him behind the ivy, just for a second. He ducked down, and I told myself it was a trick of light. But it wasn't. He was watching the tea party, watching Mrs. Blake. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. You must tell Inspector Graves. No, I can't. What if I'm wrong? What if he comes after me next? Miss Marple placed a hand on hers. You're brave, Clara. Far braver than you realize. And you've just confirmed something I've been wondering for days. What's that? That the murder wasn't planned for the library. It was planned for the garden. Clara stared. But he was found inside. Yes, but only after something went wrong. The killer staged the library, but the original intention was to confront Cyril before he entered the house. Possibly even during the tea party. But too many eyes were present. The moment wasn't right. She paused, and that means the killer panicked, which means they made mistakes. Across the village, in a quiet corner of the Green Hart Inn, Martin Price was pacing in room 4. The curtains were drawn. A single lamp lit the desk, where a worn brown envelope sat open, spilling out letters, all in Cyril's hand. One in particular was marked, to be opened only in the event of my death. Martin had read it 10 times dot, and still, he couldn't believe how Cyril had trapped him. You bastard, he whispered. You knew this was coming. Downstairs, Inspector Graves entered the inn. He had a key in his hand. Room 4's missing one, found by the chambermaid beneath the stairs dot as he climbed the steps. Miss Marple arrived at the foot of them, perfectly timed. Room 4, Inspector, she said softly. He's in there. How do you know? Because that's where the guilt was hiding. And guilt, like ivy, always returns to the wall it grew from. He didn't ask what she meant. He simply knocked Dot inside. There was silence, then movement, then the slow sound of the door unlocking. The secrets, at last, were opening. Martin Price opened the door to room 4 with the expression of a man who had already lost something, though it was not yet clear whether it was his innocence, his nerve, or simply his sleep. Inspector Graves stepped inside. Behind him came Sergeant Hensley. Miss Marple, though invited to wait outside, remained precisely where she always did. Within earshot, the room was dim and warm in a stifling, windowless way. Papers littered the desk in neat disorder. There were no clothes in the wardrobe, no toothbrush in the sink, just an envelope on the desk, open, marked, to be opened only in the event of my death. Found anything interesting, Mr. Price? Graves asked, voice low but steady. Martin stared at him for a moment, and then sat. I suppose this is where I'm meant to ask for a solicitor. That's your right. I didn't kill him. Then you'll have nothing to hide. Graves nodded to Hensley, who began bagging the letters with gloved hands. Miss Marple, still in the hall, caught the edge of Martin's voice. He wrote to me weeks ago, said he had something to confess, said he wanted to make amends. Amends? For what? Asked Graves. Martin hesitated. For ruining me. He fired me because I knew too much. Not because I was incompetent, but because I saw what he was doing with the funds. He had accounts, private ones, tied to people in this village. People he was blackmailing. Did you keep evidence? Martin gave a dry laugh. I wasn't stupid. I made copies. But now he's dead, and all the leverage is gone. Whoever killed him did it before he could make everything public. Is that why you came back? Graves pressed. To protect yourself? To hide something? No, Martin said, slowly. I came back because I was afraid someone would think I killed him, and I wanted to see the letters before anyone else did. So you admit you were behind the trellis? Martin blinked. What? You were seen. The day of the rose tea. Martin's jaw worked silently for a moment. I didn't think anyone saw. Yes, I was there, but not to harm him. I wanted to see him, just once. Before everything he built collapsed around him, Graves narrowed his eyes. You brought those cufflinks with you. What cufflinks? Graves pulled out the small evidence bag. Found in the grass near the trellis. Martin leaned forward. That's not mine. I've never owned cufflinks. Outside, Miss Marple's eyes flickered. There it was, a lie. But not from Martin Dot from the village. Later that evening, the village pulsed with news. Martin Price had been questioned. The inn-room had been searched. A letter had been found. And that's it, muttered Mrs. Godfrey to Mrs. Drake at the grocer. Case closed. Obviously, he was blackmailing Cyril, then killed him when he fought back. Mrs. Drake, who secretly adored true crime novels and considered herself an armchair expert, disagreed. No. It's all too obvious. He's a convenient villain, a red herring. If he'd done it, he'd have fled. And did you see how calm Vivian has been lately? Not grief, relief. Vivian, for her part, had returned to view, and with strange timing. She was seen walking alone in the churchyard, her dress appropriately somber, her expression unreadable. Several villagers nodded to her politely, but none invited conversation. Except one. Miss Marple met her at the iron gate near the yew trees. A walk always helps, she said gently. Vivian gave her a long, slow glance. I'm not sure anything helps anymore. Miss Marple joined her. They walked in silence for a moment. Martin didn't kill him, Vivian said suddenly. No, Miss Marple replied. I don't think he did either. Vivian stopped walking. He was angry, but not violent. He hated Cyril. But that's not why people kill. Not in villages like this. No, said Miss Marple. They kill out of shame, or fear, or to stop something from being known. Vivian turned. He was going to tell everyone, wasn't he? About the accounts, the letters, the people. Yes, was I on the list? Miss Marple said nothing. I suppose I was, Vivian murmured. But not for money, for secrets, for who I used to be before I married Cyril, before I became someone people pitied. You still know who you are. Vivian smiled. Do I? The next day, Graves convened a meeting with the coroner. Preliminary results showed no struggle, no defensive wounds. Death by a single blunt strike to the skull. The angle was precise, low, possibly delivered while seated or from behind. Still, only one suspect with motive and access, Graves said grimly, and still no murder weapon. Hensley added. Miss Marple, however, was at home examining the broken trellis again. It wasn't the break that interested her now. It was the height. The crack was at knee level, no higher, which meant whoever crouched there had done so intentionally, not to spy, not even to hide. To wait. She returned to her cottage and opened her notebook. One page stood out. A small observation she had scribbled on the day of the rose tea. Clara, hands trembling, pale, distracted, saw something but is frightened to remember. She drew a line beneath it, and then another next to Gregory Bell's name. Picked something up after Vivian dropped her cup. No one asked what it was. And then finally, beneath all the names, Martin, Vivian, Gregory, Clara, she drew a box. Inside it, she wrote, "The person no one is watching." The red herring had done its job. The village had followed it straight into the fog. But Miss Marple had learned long ago. It was never the one everyone feared. It was the one everyone trusted. It began, as twists often do, not with a scream, but with silence. On Wednesday morning, the vicarage was still. Clara Linton did not appear at the breakfast table. Her bed neatly made. Her shoes gone. Her coat missing. The Reverend assumed she had gone for a walk, as she often did when anxious. But when midday passed with no word, and the sun dipped behind, the trees without a note or message, concern rippled outward like a stone in the duck pond. By tea time, the concern had become alarm. She's never left without saying something. The Reverend told Inspector Graves, wringing his hands, not even as a girl. It isn't in her nature. She was under strain, Miss Marple added gently, more than she let on. It was Hensley who found the first clue. A torn scrap of paper in the waste bin in Clara's room, partially burned. 2 words still visible on the charred edge. He knows. Graves issued an informal search. Not yet a full missing persons alert, but enough to get the neighbors whispering. By dusk, the search party combed the woodland at the village edge. A shoe was found beside the bramble path, one of Clara's, and then, a few hundred yards further, behind a fallen log, in a shallow hollow of moss and earth, they found her alive. Barely. Clara lay curled against the log, a small gash on her forehead, her cardigan torn, hands scratched from brambles. Her eyes were open, but distant, as though she had seen something she could not place back inside herself. They rushed her to the local clinic, where the doctor declared it a concussion. Not life-threatening, but serious. She had fallen, or possibly been pushed. No memory of the hours before. No clear statement. She's fragile. The doctor warned. Whatever happened, she doesn't want to remember it. Or someone doesn't want her to. Miss Marple sat by Clara's bedside that evening, knitting slowly, watching the rhythm of her breath. And then Clara spoke. "I heard someone in the vicar's study the night before." Miss Marple paused. "Who?" "I don't know. A man, low voice, said, 'We can't let it come out. Not now. She'll talk.'" "Did he see you?" Clara's lips trembled. "I was at the stairs. I turned before he saw. I ran back to my room. I think he followed me later, but I'd already climbed out the window. I was afraid. Miss Marple folded her knitting. "You did very well, my dear." Meanwhile, the village churned with fresh scandal. The news of Clara's disappearance had revived every theory, and her return, injured, shaken, only deepened the mystery. "She must have known something," said Mrs. Langley. "Perhaps she saw the killer," muttered Mr. Bixby. "Or perhaps she didn't," whispered Mrs. Drake. "And this is a diversion." But Miss Marple had other ideas. Clara had seen something. Yes, and heard something more. Enough to make someone afraid. And afraid people make mistakes. Inspector Graves redoubled his questioning. He returned to Gregory Bell, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since Martin's interrogation. "Where were you yesterday morning?" Graves asked. "I was home," Gregory replied, "fixing a broken gutter." "Can anyone confirm that?" "No. I don't keep company when I fix gutters." Graves didn't press, but he noted the blister on Gregory's palm, fresh, red, and raw, from a tool or a fight. Then Graves turned to Vivian. She received him in the same side room, still, shrouded in calm grief. "I didn't see Clara that day," she said, "but I heard about her fall. Terrible." "Did you know she'd been in the study?" Vivian tilted her head. "No." "Why would she be?" "She may have overheard a conversation." Vivian's expression didn't shift, but her teacup, for the first time, rattled faintly. In the saucer, that night, Miss Marple invited Inspector Graves to tea. "I believe Clara's fall was no accident," she said. "Someone was afraid she'd remember something." "Do you think she's remembered it now?" "Yes, but it's buried. Not in her mind, in ours." Graves raised an eyebrow. "You and I both made the same mistake." Miss Marple continued. "We followed the obvious, the angry, the guilty-looking." Graves nodded. "Martin." "Yes, and Gregory. But the truth has been waiting somewhere else, just behind the curtain of familiarity." She opened her notebook and turned it toward him. A simple chart. Names, motives, movements, all converging around one point. Not Martin. Not Gregory. But someone Clara trusted. Someone in the VICARAGE. Miss Marple tapped the name gently. "You must speak with the Reverend," she said softly. Graves frowned. "The vicar, he has a key to every door, including the study, including the past." That evening, the Reverend Timothy Finch was found in his study, hands trembling as he packed a small suitcase. He didn't resist when Graves entered. "I didn't mean for her to fall," he said quietly. "I only meant to scare her." "Why?" Graves asked. "Because she knew," the Reverend whispered. "She knew about Cyril and the letters. Knew that he and I had history. Knew that he was going to expose us all." "Expose what?" "The money, the silence, the things we let happen to protect reputations. Even mine." Graves stared. "You were involved in the accounts." "No, but I helped hide them years ago, before I ever became vicar here. I thought it was buried, but Cyril kept records, threatened to reveal everything. So you killed him?" "No." The Reverend looked up. "I wanted to stop Clara from speaking. I admit that. But I didn't kill Cyril. I wanted him alive. he kept others quiet. Outside, Miss Marple stood beneath the stars, listening. There it was again. The final twist hadn't come yet. But it was close, because the Reverend was not a killer. He was a coward, and someone else was still hiding behind the ivy dot. It was always. The quiet moment afterward, the hush that followed the noise, that allowed things to click into place. For Miss Marple, that moment came just past midnight, alone in her cottage. As the wind curled against the glass and the teapot steamed gently beside her, the vicar's confession had shaken the village. Not because he had harmed Clara, but because he had been part of a hidden network, a web of silences, favors, moral compromises. St. Elwick's, it turned out, had many sins, but only one murder, and Miss Marple, at last, could see it clearly. She lit the small reading lamp by her chair and opened her notebook for the final time. The entries were neat, clinical, but beneath them lay emotion, disappointment, sadness, a faint grief at what human beings were capable of. She drew a circle around a name she had, until now, carefully avoided marking: Gregory Bell. Not because he was the most suspicious, but because he was the easiest to dismiss. His passion had made him loud, yes, but that same passion made him seem incapable of subtlety. And yet, he was the only one who had moved within every part of the village without notice. He had no alibi. No one had seen him after the tea party. Until the next morning, he had retrieved something from the ground after Vivian fled. He had been dismissed as emotional, volatile, but that had merely made him visible, distractingly visible. The perfect disguise. Miss Marple stood, slipped on her coat, and stepped out into the cool night. The ivy rustled gently beside her garden path. She walked to the Blake residence. Vivian was awake. She answered the door in her dressing gown, unsurprised. "I knew you'd come," she said. "I've been waiting." Inside, Miss Marple settled into the chair across from her. Clara is resting. The vicar has been questioned, and Martin has been cleared. That leaves very few threads unknotted. Vivian poured tea in silence. "You saw him, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked, behind the trellis. "That's why you dropped the cup." Vivian hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but not Martin. I thought it was Gregory, just for a moment. And I was afraid, because you knew what he was capable of, because I knew what he wanted." Miss Marple leaned forward. What did he want? Vivian's eyes brimmed. He wanted Cyril to confess, publicly. Wanted to destroy him. Gregory thought I would help him. That we were allies. Were you? I once believed I was. But Gregory grew obsessed. He spoke of justice. But all I saw was revenge. Something darker. He wasn't interested in exposing corruption. He wanted to punish. And when I said I wouldn't help, he stopped speaking to me. That was 3 weeks ago. Did Cyril know Gregory had approached you? Yes. And he wrote Gregory a letter. I saw the draft. It was scathing. He planned to send it after the tea. Said it would cut Gregory out of the will. Cyril was theatrical that way. And then Cyril ended up dead. Miss Marple said softly. Vivian nodded. I think Gregory saw him at the tea party. or perhaps he followed him home. Either way, it happened that evening. Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Vivian. I believe that's all I needed." She left the Blake house just before dawn, the sky blushing at the horizon. The air smelled of grass and the faintest trace of wood smoke. The scent of endings dot by. Mid-morning, Inspector Graves had summoned Gregory Bell to the station. They sat across from one another, quiet as mirrors. "You've denied being behind the trellis," Graves said, "but 3 witnesses place you near the scene. Clara, Vivian, and Miss Marple." Gregory swallowed. "That doesn't mean I killed him. We found the note," Graves continued. "The one you picked up after Vivian dropped her cup. It was folded, dirty, but the handwriting matched Cyril Blake's. It read, 'You have until this evening to explain yourself.' After that, I go public." Gregory's face went white. "I was angry. I didn't kill him. You picked up the note. You followed him. You argued. No, you had motive. You had no alibi. And the cufflink we found, engraved CJ, it was a gift from Cyril. You wore it the day of the tea." Gregory stood sharply, knocking his chair back. "It wasn't meant to happen like that. I just wanted to scare him, to make him stop. I didn't mean to." The room fell silent. Graves spoke slowly. "You didn't mean to what?" Gregory sat again, quieter now. "I waited behind the trellis. I thought he'd come through the garden. I was going to confront him, show him the letter, demand he retract it. But he didn't come. No, he took the side path. I panicked. I came through the back door. Found him in the library. He saw me, laughed, said I was pathetic, said I'd never matter. His voice broke. I picked up the poker. I don't remember swinging, just the silence afterward." Graves closed his notebook. "Thank you for your honesty." Outside the station, Miss Marple waited. She watched as Gregory was led away. He did not look at her. She did not feel victory, only sorrow. Some murders are born of passion, others of planning. But this was the kind that grew slowly, from wounded pride, from broken ideals, from the desperate wish to matter. She returned home and sat by the ivy trellis. The wind moved it gently. Behind it, all the shadows had finally vanished, but the shape of them, like the memory of a ghost, would always remain. Miss Marple had heard the confession. Inspector Graves had made the arrest. And yet, a strange restlessness remained in the air, like a house left empty, but still humming with old conversation. The village had a name to blame now, Gregory Bell, and yet the pieces hadn't quite settled. Not for her. It wasn't that she doubted his guilt. It was the neatness of it. Confession or not, Miss Marple's instincts, honed over countless firesides and funerals, told her something vital was missing. Gregory had killed Cyril Blake. Yes, but someone had helped him. Someone had moved through the edges of the story, untroubled, unmentioned. And now, she needed proof. Not for the police, but for herself. On Thursday afternoon, she invited several people to tea. Vivian Blake arrived first, still graceful in mourning, wrapped in a charcoal shawl. She did not ask who else would attend, which told Miss Marple all she needed. Next came Martin Price, who looked slightly less nervous than usual and had clearly made an effort with his tie. Then Clara Linton, pale but upright, her hands clutched around a folded note Miss Marple had sent that morning. A final thread needs sewing. Come and bring your courage. Finally, the Reverend Finch arrived, visibly uncomfortable, not yet forgiven by his village or himself. For guests, one hostess. No inspector, no formal inquiry, just tea and conversation and the slow laying out of traps. They sat in the drawing room, the window open, the ivy visible beyond. Miss Marple poured the tea herself, as she always did. She spoke lightly about the weather, about the rose show coming up in nearby Little Wentworth, and how the dahlias had suffered this season due to overwatering. Everyone relaxed, just slightly, and then, quietly, she said, "I suppose you've heard that Gregory Bell confessed." Martin nodded stiffly. Vivian raised her cup. The Reverend crossed his legs. Clara froze, of course. Miss Marple continued, "That does leave one question unanswered." "And what's that?" asked Martin, a little too quickly. Miss Marple smiled. "How did the letter get from Cyril to Gregory in the first place?" The room went still. "You see," she went on, her voice as gentle as ever, "Cyril wrote that letter during the tea. It was never posted, never handed off publicly, and yet Gregory had it, which means someone delivered it between the time it was written and the moment it was found." Martin looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Clara. Clara looked down. "I didn't," Clara started. "I know," Miss Marple said kindly. "You didn't. But someone else did." She set her teacup down. "There's more. The poker was wiped clean, yet Gregory's fingerprints were on it. That means someone tried to clean it and failed. Gregory never mentioned wiping it. So again, someone helped. Afterward, after the murder." Vivian stood. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple didn't blink. "I'm suggesting that Gregory may have struck the blow, but he did not act alone. Someone knew he would confront Cyril, knew where Cyril would be. Someone who wanted him gone." Vivian's face remained unreadable. "Perhaps even someone," Miss Marple continued softly, "who made sure Gregory found that letter, planted it, fed his rage." Martin stood as well. "You can't accuse. I haven't accused anyone," Miss Marple said. "But I can tell you that the cufflink we found wasn't Gregory's. And it wasn't Cyril's. It belonged to someone else entirely. A man who ordered a pair from Mr. Groves last year and asked that they be engraved with the initials CJ." She turned to Martin. "Your full name, I believe, is Charles Martin Price." Martin froze. Vivian's teacup clinked, ever so softly, against its saucer. "I only kept one," Martin said, his voice thin. "Cyril insisted they be returned when I left. I didn't think anyone would ever." "You dropped it behind the trellis," Miss Marple said. "Not during the murder. Before. You were the one crouched there, not Gregory. You watched the tea party, saw Vivian react, saw Gregory pick up the letter, and you knew what would happen next." Martin slumped into the chair. "He ruined me," he whispered. "Humiliated me. But I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple said. "But you lit the match." She looked to Vivian. And you let it burn. Vivian didn't speak. Her face was pale, drawn. And then, quietly, she said, "He asked me to help him. Martin said Cyril needed to be exposed. Said we could trap him in his lies. But I never agreed to murder. But you didn't stop it." Miss Marple said gently, "You saw Gregory spiral. You watched the tea fall apart. You let the letter fall where Gregory could find it. And after the murder, you helped clean the poker." Vivian's voice trembled. "I loved Cyril once, and then I didn't. I was afraid of him, of what he'd tell people, of what I'd become. So you said nothing." "I said nothing," she echoed. "And that was enough." Miss Marple stood. "There's a kind of justice in the world," she said softly. "It doesn't always wear a badge, but it waits." Quietly, she turned to Clara, who hadn't spoken. "My dear," she said, "you saw more than you realized. You saw not only a killer, but a community choosing silence." Clara nodded. "I don't think we need the inspector for this part," Miss Marple said to the room. "I suspect Martin will be leaving the village, quietly, and Vivian will not be invited to host next year's rose tea. But the truth, the whole truth, must settle here, among us, in memory." She opened the window. The ivy fluttered. In the breeze, free now from secrets. And for the first time in weeks, Miss Marple smiled. The trap had been set, and the truth had walked into it, all on its own. Truth does not always shout. Often it mumbles. Sometimes it slips out not in confession, but in conversation, a stray word, an unintended remark, a misremembered lie. And Miss Marple, who had seen all manner of people undone by their own tongues, knew how to wait for just such a moment. The tea had ended. Vivian and Martin had left. Clara lingered, reluctant to return to the vicarage. Miss Marple offered her a second cup and a plate of ginger biscuits. "Did you ever know what was in that letter Gregory picked up?" Miss Marple asked her gently. Clara shook her head. "No, but I knew it upset Vivian terribly. She was pale as paper." Miss Marple studied her. "And you've been brave, my dear. Truly. But I wonder, do you remember something else? Something you're unsure whether to say?" Clara hesitated. Then, as if a knot had come loose in her chest, she said, "There was something after the night Cyril died. I couldn't sleep. I was restless, so I walked outside." "Where did you walk?" "To the back garden. I thought the fresh air might help. I passed by the Blake house." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. "I saw someone coming from the back door," Clara said slowly, "carrying something wrapped in a cloth. Something long, I think. It was the poker." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Do you remember who it was?" "I do now," she said. "I've tried not to, but I do." Miss Marple nodded once. "Thank you, Clara." That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit, her final, necessary visit, to Vivian Blake. The house was quiet. A single lamp cast warm light over the parlor. Vivian stood by the hearth, a book in hand, unread. "I thought we said everything earlier," she said without turning around. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "except for one thing. The thing you let slip." Vivian turned now. "I don't know what you mean." at the tea when you said you saw Gregory behind the trellis. You said he wore his coat with the high collar. Yes, I remember. And yet, no one had mentioned that coat. Not even Clara. But Gregory hadn't worn it in weeks. He left it at the tailor for repairs and collected it the day after the murder. Vivian froze. That's the slip. Miss Marple said, "You described a coat you could not have seen unless you'd known beforehand. Unless you had arranged it, or were part of it." Vivian sat down. There was no performance now. No glamour. No veil of sorrow. Only the truth. "I didn't want him dead," she said. "But you wanted him silenced." She nodded. "He knew too much. About me. About Martin. About the Reverend. He held it over all of us. You and Martin orchestrated. A push, a nudge, a way to make Gregory do what neither of you could." Vivian looked up. Tears unshed. And it worked. Until it didn't. There was silence between them, long and painful. Miss Marple stood. "You won't be arrested. You didn't strike the blow. But you'll live with it. And that's its own sentence." Vivian's voice was nearly a whisper. "He never loved me, you know, Cyril. He loved power. He loved leverage. But not me, perhaps." Miss Marple said gently, "But we all become someone else in another person's memory." She left Vivian alone in the room where her husband had once ruled, and where, in a way, he still did, back in her cottage. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The world outside was quiet. The village, for once, had no theories to spin, no suspects to glare at. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it was settled. She reflected on the events, the web of guilt, the misused trust, the emotion that had turned to manipulation, then murder, and how, in the end, it had been not evidence, but words, the slip of a tongue, that unraveled the final knot. The killer had confessed, but the truth had spoken earlier. All it took was someone who knew how to listen. The drawing room of the Blake residence had once been a space for careful hospitality. Crystal glasses, cream walls, tasteful florals. But now it served a different purpose, truth-telling. Inspector Graves stood beside the fireplace. Arms folded, beside him sat Sergeant Hensley, notebook at the ready. In the center, Vivian Blake, composed but hollow-eyed, rested on the edge of an armchair. Martin Price leaned against the wall by the window, arms crossed defensively. Gregory Bell, though already in custody, had been brought in under quiet supervision. He sat farthest from the others, staring at the floor, and finally, in a corner, near the sideboard, quiet and unassuming, was Miss Marple. She didn't rise. She didn't need to. She began in the same voice she used when recounting a story about her nephew Raymond's birthday cake. Soft, precise, with just enough pause to ensure no one interrupted. "This murder," she said, "was never about hatred. Not directly. It was about control. About one man holding a village in the palm of his hand. And the cracks that formed when he began to lose his grip." Graves nodded for her to continue. Cyril Blake had secrets, and he collected others' secrets, too. He used them, held them, manipulated people with them. He had evidence of Reverend Finch's financial indiscretions from years past. He had A letter from Martin Price, one that could have destroyed his future. He even had details of Vivian's life before she became Mrs. Blake, which she worked very hard to leave behind. She glanced at Vivian, whose knuckles whitened. Each of you feared what Cyril might do, but only one of you feared it enough to act. She looked at Gregory. You struck the blow. That is true, and tragic. But you didn't plan it. You were led to it. Gregory looked up sharply. No one. You received a letter. Miss Marple interrupted gently. That enraged you. A final insult from Cyril. But it was never meant for you. It was bait. Folded and dropped at just the right moment, when Vivian rose from the tea table, creating distraction. Inspector Graves blinked. You're saying the letter was never delivered by Cyril. It was planted, and not by him. She turned to Martin. You watched from behind the trellis. You'd been in that garden before. You knew the layout. You placed the letter near Gregory's feet, and you let the storm begin. Martin opened his mouth, but no words came. Miss Marple smiled, not unkindly. You had motive. Cyril had humiliated you, dismissed you, and held your future in his grip. But you lacked the courage to strike him, so you let someone else do it. Someone you knew would lash out, if pushed just right. Then she turned to Vivian. And you, my dear, were complicit. You saw Gregory find the letter. You knew what it would do. You had the opportunity to stop him, to speak, to intervene. Vivian swallowed hard. I hoped he would just confront him. You hoped, Miss Marple said softly, but you also watched. You were the first to see Gregory arrive at the house after the party. You opened the back door for him. The room fell deathly still after the murder. Miss Marple continued. You helped wipe the poker. You turned the chair. You staged the scene. You did not kill your husband, Vivian, but you ensured he died alone. Vivian was pale. Lids parted, but she didn't deny it. Graves stepped forward. Miss Marple, are you suggesting? I am suggesting, she said calmly, that this was not a murder born of rage. It was born of orchestration, a trap for Cyril, designed by those he hurt, and executed by the one person. Too impulsive to see the strings. Gregory stood, voice cracking. They used me. Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. Yes, and you let yourself be used. But you also made your choice. You picked up the poker. Graves looked to Vivian. We'll need a formal statement. Vivian nodded, defeated. I'll give it. Martin sat down, shaking his head. It was supposed to be justice. No, Miss Marple said gently. Justice is clear and clean. This was revenge, and it rarely ends cleanly. The room exhaled, tension unraveling in waves. Graves called in two officers to escort Gregory and Martin separately. Vivian remained, unmoving, in her chair. Miss Marple stood at last. This village will heal, she said softly. It always does, but never the same. The cracks will remain, like in old china. As she left, she passed the ivy trellis, still dancing faintly in the wind. The scene was empty now. No shadow behind it, no watcher, no secret, just the ordinary rustle of leaves, and the memory of how close evil had sat to the garden tea. There was no thunderclap, No dramatic storm to wash away the blood, just days that followed one after the other. In that quietly devastating way English days do, as if nothing had happened and everything had. The villagers of St. Elwick's returned to their routines, but with unease in their bones. People nodded politely in the lanes, but didn't linger. Doors that once stood ajar were now drawn tight. The ivy around the trellis had begun to brown at the edges, as though even it had absorbed too much and could no longer hold its green. Gregory Bell was formally charged, his trial scheduled for the autumn. The newspapers carried a small piece. On the case, shocking murder in Dorset Village, solicitor bludgeoned in library. The headline was lurid, but the article spared the village its dirtiest truths. Martin Price vanished from St. Elwick's 2 days later. Officially, he had returned to London to take up a post in a different firm. Unofficially, no one wanted to be the one to see him off. He left no forwarding address and no apology. Vivian Blake remained. The villagers debated this endlessly. Some believed she should have left. Others said she had every right to stay in her home. She walked the village rarely now, early mornings mostly, head high but gaze lowered. Miss Marple encountered her only once in the weeks that followed. They passed in the baker's lane. Vivian paused. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "For what?" Miss Marple asked gently. "For not destroying me entirely." Miss Marple met her eyes. "That wasn't my choice, my dear. It was yours." Vivian gave the faintest of nods before walking on Dot at the vicarage. Reverend Finch returned to his duties, though with a quieter presence than before. His sermons were shorter, his voice more fragile. Clara Linton stayed, but something in her had shifted too, her shyness replaced by a kind of steady steel. She visited Miss Marple one afternoon in early September and brought a plum tart. "I've started applying to teach at the school," she said with a small smile. "I think I'd like to do something that matters." "I think you already have," Miss Marple said, accepting the tart. The garden had begun to change by then, summer slipping into its decline. The roses were spent, the hydrangeas drooped, the bees moved more slowly, as if tired of all the secrets they'd flown over. People continued to speculate about the case, of course. That never quite stopped. "But did Vivian really plan it?" asked Mrs. Drake at the greengrocer's. "I heard Martin forged the letter entirely," countered Mrs. Godfrey. "No one ever proved what was in the safe deposit box," said Mr. Bixby, lowering his voice. And through it all, Miss Marple went about her business, shopping, writing letters, reading small print novels. The village, she knew, would forget the details eventually. They always did. But the shape of it, the feeling of it, would remain. And so would the lesson. One afternoon, Inspector Graves stopped by her cottage. He brought with him a pot of raspberry jam and an air of tired gratitude. "I still don't know how you pieced it together," he said. "Neither do I, really," Miss Marple replied. "I just paid attention." "What happens now?" "Now?" She stirred her tea. "Now the village convinces itself it's safe again." He smiled faintly. "Do you think it is?" "No," she said softly. "But it never was." Graves looked down at his hands. "It's strange. Cyril Blake was cruel. manipulative, a bully, and yet I can't help but feel sorry for him. That's human, Miss Marple said. He created enemies, yes, but he also created the means of his own destruction. That's the saddest part. He couldn't stop himself, and those around him couldn't either. They sat in silence a moment, the kettle still warm, the ivy rustling faintly through the window. "You ever think about stopping?" Graves asked. Putting away the sleuthing, Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, I never started. I just observe. It's the rest of the world that insists on being dramatic." He laughed, thanked her for the tea, and took his leave. That evening, Miss Marple walked through her garden. She stopped at the trellis, now partially repaired. The new wood gleamed brighter than the old, a thin scar of color against the white. She touched it gently, a reminder that even the most beautiful structures can conceal rot. That people are often like vines. They grow how they must, not always how they should. And that even when the truth comes out, it doesn't always bring peace, but sometimes it brings quiet. And in St. Elwick's, for now, quiet would have to do. Autumn arrived quietly in St. Elwick's. Leaves turned gold and fell in slow spirals across the high street. Smoke curled from chimneys again. The days shortened, and the nights brought back that familiar hush, as if the village, exhausted by truth, had finally allowed itself to exhale. But while life resumed, it did not resume untouched. The annual harvest fete took place, though with a more subdued atmosphere than usual. The jam competition went on, but this time no one joked when Miss Alcott forgot her labels, and no one argued over the weight of Mr. Penberry's marrow. The laughter was softer, edged with caution. The Blake house remained under Vivian's care. She stayed, to the surprise of many, though she no longer played hostess. The curtains stayed drawn more often. She gardened in the early mornings, head down, gloves on. Ivy now covered nearly the entire trellis, but she never trimmed it. No one asked her to. At the church, Clara Linton stood taller these days. She taught music to the children on Thursdays, helped coordinate readings for Sunday services, and had even taken over managing the autumn charity box. The villagers spoke of her differently now, not as someone delicate, but as someone who had seen something and survived it. Reverend Finch, though still respected, was quieter in the pulpit. His sermons lost their fire and grew more reflective. He no longer spoke with certainty, only hope, and in a strange way that made him more human, more reachable. Martin Price was spoken of only in passing, as though he had become a myth. That poor man from the solicitor's office, some would say, or the one who left just before it all came out. But his name never lingered. Long in conversation, Gregory Bell remained in holding until trial. Letters arrived for him, but he replied to none. It was said he had grown thin, that he didn't sleep, but no one went to visit, not even his uncle. And Cyril Blake, his name, once said with measured respect or quiet dread, was now spoken with a strange, almost guilty tone, as if people couldn't quite decide how to remember him. His portrait, once hung in the village hall for his generous civic donations, was quietly removed. No one said who took it down. Miss Marple as always, remained part of the scenery, and apart from it, she resumed her seat in the tea shop window, resumed her walks at dusk. But people now greeted her with a new caution, a touch more reverent, a touch more careful. It wasn't fear. It was recognition that she had seen more than anyone else. Again, she never spoke of the case in public, never gave interviews, never shared what Clara had whispered to her in confidence. She simply resumed the act of watching, and she noticed things. She noticed how Mr. Bixby no longer gossiped in front of his apprentices. She noticed how Mrs. Langley checked the back door twice before locking up at night. She noticed how even the children walked a little more quietly past the Blake residence. And she noticed something else, a resilience, not the forced cheerfulness of a village desperate to forget, but the subtle, sincere attempt to heal. There were new friendships forming, old ones quietly mending. People gave each other space, but also kindness. They held their silences more gently. One morning, in the second week of October, Miss Marple received a letter. It was unsigned, but she recognized the writing. "You were right. I should have stopped it. I let him walk in, and I did nothing. You didn't expose me because you knew that was punishment enough. I'm trying now, trying to be a different sort of person. I don't know if that will ever be enough, but I wanted you to know. I'm trying." She folded the letter and placed it in her drawer beside the rose-patterned envelopes she saved for rainy days. In the garden, the last of the dahlias had bloomed. Their petals were imperfect now, wind-blown, frayed at the edges, but still standing. And that, Miss Marple thought, was what mattered most. The village would never return to the way it was, but it had become something else, wiser, quieter, bruised, but standing. And in its own quiet, careful way, it was still beautiful. It was a month after the arrest when the final thread surfaced, not in a police file, nor a late confession, but in a library book. Miss Marple, as was her habit, visited the St. Elwick's Lending Library every Thursday. It was a small building tucked behind the post office, with narrow aisles and polished wood that still held the scent of beeswax and paper ink. She had returned a volume of the Moral Landscape and was browsing the fiction shelves when something caught her eye. It wasn't the title, The Longest Walk Home, but the note that slipped from between its pages as she opened it. The paper was small and aged, folded twice. No envelope, no signature. She read it once, then again, and then she sat down. To whoever finds this, I didn't mean for him to die. I only meant to make him pause, to feel what I felt, helpless. I thought it would scare him. I didn't expect he'd laugh, and I didn't expect how easy it would be. Once I raised my hand. They say a moment can define you. That moment did, and now I'll never be anything else in their eyes. But if anyone remembers me, let it be the part of me that hesitated. G.B. Gregory Bell. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and slipped it into her handbag. She did not take it to Inspector Graves. She did not file it as evidence. She walked out into the autumn air and returned home, where the garden had begun to yellow and crisp at the edges. She boiled water for tea and sat by her window. The confession was not legally necessary, but emotionally, it shifted something. It gave Gregory back his humanity. It confirmed what she had always suspected, that even in the moment of violence, he had not been empty of conscience. He had simply lost hold of it. She tucked the note into a small leather journal she kept under lock and key. It was not a diary. Exactly. It was a record of things that had never made it into public accounts. Small truths to fragile for trial, to private for justice. In the end, the murder of Cyril Blake had not been about good or evil. It had been about damage, layered, inherited, left unchecked until it became contagious. The powerful hurt the weak. The weak struck back. And between them, silence had festered. But now, there was acknowledgement. And in that, a faint hope. That evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting by the fire, a letter arrived from her nephew Raymond. He invited her to visit Devon for a few days. The sea air, he wrote, would do her good. There were new literary friends to meet, and someone had recently quoted her at a lecture on intuition in literature. She smiled. She would go, not because she needed a rest. She never did. But because it was time to step away from the trellis, to let the ivy grow back without watching for ghosts. And yet, as she packed a small case the next morning, she paused at her window. Vivian Blake stood in her garden, pruning roses, and behind her, just for a flicker of a second, someone moved beyond the hedge. A man in a brown coat, walking slowly, almost thoughtfully, along the back lane. His steps did not falter. He did not turn. But Miss Marple saw him. Gregory Bell. Impossible. Or perhaps not. She didn't call out, didn't follow. Instead, she returned to her packing. Some truths must not be chased. Some ghosts must be allowed to walk home alone. She closed her case, took one last look at the ivy-covered fence, and whispered, "Rest now." And with that, she left St. Elwick's behind for a while and let the village learn how to live again. Not in fear, not in forgetting, but in something far more difficult. In understanding.